38 years. That's how long it took me to build something out of nothing. 38 years of early mornings, skipped vacations, and a back that never quite stopped aching after the accident in 2009. When I finally sold the landscaping company I had started with a borrowed truck and $17 in my pocket, I walked out of the attorney's office with a cashier's check and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. I didn't cry. I just sat there with my hands in my lap and thought about my husband, Daniel, who had died 4 years before he got to see any of it. I thought about how I had promised him, standing at his bedside in that pale hospital room, that I would be okay, that everything we had worked for would be protected. I whispered to him that day, "I'll take care of it." I meant every word. I was 61 years old when I deposited that money. I moved it into 2 accounts, a long-term investment account and a liquid savings account I kept for what I called the quiet years. That was my phrase for retirement. The quiet years, I had earned them. I had bled for them. I planned to spend them gardening, traveling to see my sister in Tucson, and finally learning to paint watercolors the way my mother had always wanted me to. I was ready. For the first time in almost 4 decades, I was genuinely, deeply ready. My son was 34 at the time. He had my husband's eyes and his father's easy smile, the kind that made strangers trust him immediately. He had always been the one people wanted to be around. Funny, quick with a joke, the sort of man who could walk into any room and make it feel warmer. His wife, my daughter-in-law, was sharp in a way that I had always quietly admired, even when it made me uncomfortable. She had a way of asking questions that sounded like compliments. I didn't understand what I was looking at back then. I understand it perfectly now. They had been struggling, or so they told me. His contracting business had taken a hit after a bad subcontract deal fell through, and they were behind on 2 loan payments. My daughter-in-law had started her own interior design firm the year before, and it wasn't yet generating the income she'd projected. They came to me in the spring, both of them sitting at my kitchen table with coffee mugs they weren't drinking from, and my son looked at me the way he used to when he was 8 years old and had broken something he thought was irreplaceable. "Mom," he said, "we just need a little help to get through this rough patch." I asked him how much. He said $40,000. I said I would think about it. My daughter-in-law reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "You've always been so generous. We wouldn't be asking if we had any other option." I transferred $40,000 2 weeks later. I didn't ask for paperwork. He was my son. Daniel would have done the same thing. 6 months passed. Then he came back. This time it was $60,000 for a commercial property opportunity that he said could double the investment within 18 months. I was more hesitant this time, and I told him so. My daughter-in-law had prepared a folder with projections and a property overview. It looked professional. It looked real. I asked if I could have a week to look it over. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need." I gave them the $60,000. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters. I was not a naive woman. I had run a business for nearly 4 decades. I had negotiated contracts, managed employees, weathered 2 recessions, and rebuilt after a flood nearly wiped out my equipment yard in 2003. I was not someone who did not understand money or people, but there is a particular blindness that comes from love, and I had it for my son. I could see every angle of a business negotiation with perfect clarity, and I could not see what was happening at my own kitchen table. The transfers continued over the next 14 months. Some were smaller, $12,000 for an equipment lease, $8,000 for a legal retainer on the property deal. Some were larger. There was one for $95,000 that my son told me was to close the commercial property purchase before another buyer stepped in. He called me from what he said was a parking lot outside the title company. His voice was urgent, pressed, the way it sounds when someone is watching a door about to close. I transferred the money the same afternoon. I never saw documents for that property. When I asked, there was always a reason. The title company needed another week. The closing had been rescheduled. The seller was difficult. I started writing the amounts in a small notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer, the kind with a red cover that I had used for grocery lists for years. I don't know why I started doing that. Something in me was keeping a record before I was willing to admit to myself that I needed one. I remember the exact morning everything changed. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of morning that comes once or twice a year in Tennessee, where the air is cool and clean and the light through the window is the color of honey. I had slept well for the first time in weeks. I made coffee, stood at the counter in my bathrobe, and opened the banking app on my phone to check a routine transfer I had scheduled for my electric bill. The balance on my liquid savings account read $4,211. I stood very still. I looked at the number again. I set my coffee cup down carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't fully working yet. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the full transaction history. The most recent transfer was for $47,000. It had cleared 2 days earlier. The memo line read, "Final closing costs, Meridian Property." I scrolled back, transfer after transfer, going back across the 14 months, amounts I recognized and amounts I did not, all moving in one direction, out. Some of the larger ones I had authorized, but as I scrolled further back, I began to see transfers I did not recognize, smaller amounts, a few thousand here, 1,200 there, dated on days when I had not spoken to my son, had not agreed to anything, had not received a single phone call. I went to my office and opened my laptop. I pulled up the second account, the long-term investment account I had told my son was not to be touched under any circumstances. I had been clear about this. I had used those exact words, "This money is not to be touched." The balance was $6,088. I sat in my chair for a long time without moving. The coffee on my desk went cold. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard, and somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up, and the world was going on exactly as it always had, completely indifferent to the fact that my entire future had just been taken from me. I did not cry. I did not call my son. I opened the red notebook in the kitchen drawer, and I laid it flat on the desk next to my laptop, and I began to compare every number I had written down against every transaction on the screen. It took me almost 3 hours. When I was finished, the number I had authorized, the total of every conversation at my kitchen table, every urgent phone call, every folder with projections, came to $214,000. The total that had been removed from my accounts was $381,500. The difference between those two numbers, $167,500, I had never discussed with anyone. I had never agreed to it. I had never seen a memo, received a call, or signed anything. It had simply been taken, quietly, incrementally, in amounts small enough that no single one of them would have triggered an immediate alarm. I closed the laptop. I put the notebook back in the drawer. I finished my cold coffee standing at the sink. Then, I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled my business affairs for 11 years. She is the kind of woman who speaks slowly on the phone and quickly in a courtroom. And when I told her what I had found, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Margaret, don't transfer anything, don't delete anything, and don't call your son yet." "Can you come in this afternoon?" I told her I could. "Good," she said. "Bring the notebook. I want to tell you about the 2 days between that Tuesday morning and the moment I confronted my son, because those 2 days are important, and I think people don't talk enough about what that waiting period is actually like. You know the truth. You are living inside it, but you have not yet spoken it out loud, and there is something about the silence of those hours that is its own kind of grief. I cooked dinner. I watched television. I called my sister in Tucson and talked about her garden for 45 minutes and did not say a single word about what I knew. I lay awake the first night and looked at the ceiling and thought about the morning my son was born, how I had held him in the hospital and felt something settle inside me that had never been settled before. I thought about teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway of our first house. I thought about the way he had cried at his father's funeral. Deep, wrecked, genuine sobs that I had held him through for a long time. I thought about all of that. And then I thought about $167,500 taken without a word. Patricia had already spoken to a forensic accountant by the time I arrived at her office. They had identified the access pattern. My son had been added to both accounts as an authorized user 18 months earlier, during a period when I had needed help managing some bill payments after a minor surgery. My daughter-in-law's name appeared as a co-signer on 3 of the larger unauthorized transfers. They had done it together. They had planned it together. And the commercial property in Meridian that my son had described so carefully, the one with the seller who was always difficult and the closing that kept being rescheduled, that property did not exist. Patricia said the word fraud in a quiet, even tone, the way you say a word you have said many times before and no longer need to brace yourself for. I nodded. I was not surprised. I think I had known, somewhere underneath everything, for longer than I wanted to admit. I asked her what my options were. She laid them out methodically. We could pursue a civil case for recovery of funds. We could file a criminal complaint, which would involve law enforcement and a potential prosecution. We could do both. She told me that given the documented access, the transfer records, and the unauthorized amounts, the criminal case was strong. She also told me it was my decision entirely, and that she would support whatever I chose. I asked her how long a criminal case would take. She said it could be 1 to 3 years from filing to sentencing. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her to file the complaint. My son called me on a Thursday evening, 4 days after I had spoken to Patricia. His voice was the version of his voice I had only heard a handful of times, stripped of the easy warmth, flat and careful. The voice of someone who has just realized the game has changed. "Mom," he said, "I need to talk to you." I told him I thought that was a good idea. He came over the next morning, alone, without my daughter-in-law, which I noted. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair he had always sat in, and he started with the version. I had expected the business had been worse than he let on. They were desperate. He had always intended to pay it back. He had a plan. He said the word sorry several times in the first 2 minutes, quickly, the way people say a word when they are hoping the word itself will do the work so they don't have to. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. When he was done, I slid the printed account statements across the table to him, the ones with the unauthorized transfers highlighted in yellow. "I need you to explain these to me," I said. He looked at them for a moment. Then he said, "I can explain all of that." I said, "Please do." He couldn't. He stumbled through half a sentence about a miscommunication with the bank, and I watched his face while he said it, and I recognized the expression on it. It was the same expression he had worn as a teenager when I had caught him in a lie he hadn't finished constructing yet. Some things do not change. "I've spoken to an attorney," I said. "A complaint has been filed." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. He said, "Mom, I'm your son." I said, "I know who you are." He left without finishing his coffee. My daughter-in-law called me that afternoon and left a voicemail. Her voice in the voicemail was very different from her voice at my kitchen table, thinner, higher, with a quality underneath it that I had not heard from her before. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said she had always respected me. She said she hoped we could resolve this as a family. I listened to the message once, saved it, and forwarded it to Patricia. What happened over the next several months was both harder and more clarifying than I had expected. My son hired an attorney. My daughter-in-law hired a separate one, and this detail, separate attorneys, told me something I already suspected. They were each preparing to point at the other. My sister called from Tucson after she heard what happened, and she was angrier than I was, which I found oddly comforting. A few people I had known for years told me, carefully, that perhaps I should consider what a criminal prosecution would do to my son's future, to any children they might have one day, to the family. One person said to me, "He made a terrible mistake, but he's still your son." I told her that I was aware of that. I also told her that I was 63 years old and that the money they had taken was the only financial security I had left, the result of 38 years of work, and that if I did not pursue this, I would be spending my quiet years not in a garden in Tucson or learning to paint watercolors, but figuring out how to cover my medical expenses on Social Security. She didn't have much to say after that. There were moments during those months when I almost wavered. I want to be honest about that too. There was an evening in February when I was driving home from Patricia's office, and I passed the park where I used to take my son when he was small, and I had to pull over for a few minutes. There was a Sunday in March when I found an old photograph of the three of us, me, Daniel, and my son, at maybe 9 or 10 years old, at a lake somewhere in North Carolina, and I held it for a long time before I put it face down in the drawer. But I did not waver in any way that mattered. The district attorney's office moved forward with charges against both my son and my daughter-in-law. Theft by deception, financial exploitation, unauthorized access to financial accounts. The amounts were large enough and the documentation clear enough that the case moved with more speed than I had expected. My daughter-in-law's separate attorney tried to negotiate a plea arrangement that would have reduced her exposure significantly in exchange for testimony about my son's role in initiating the scheme. Patricia told me about this and asked if I had any objection to the DA considering it. I said I did. I told her that from where I sat, they had both sat at my kitchen table. They had both held my hands. They had both looked me in the eye and described properties and projections and plans that did not exist. I was not interested in a resolution where one of them walked away clean. The DA ultimately did not offer the arrangement my daughter-in-law's attorney had sought. I testified at the sentencing hearing. I had written my statement over 3 evenings at the kitchen table, the same table where they had come to me with their coffee mugs and their folder of projections. I did not write it to be cruel. I wrote it to be accurate. I described what I had built and how long it had taken. I described the specific ways that my ability to care for myself in the coming years had been affected. I described standing in the kitchen in my bathrobe on a Tuesday morning in October and seeing the number $4,211 on a screen when I had expected to see something close to $400,000. I looked at my son when I read the statement. He was looking at the table. My daughter-in-law was looking at her hands. The judge sentenced my son to 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2.5. My daughter-in-law received 3 years, with parole eligibility after 22 months. Both were ordered to pay full restitution, the entire $381,500, jointly and severally liable, which Patricia explained meant that each of them was fully responsible for the whole amount, regardless of how they divided it between themselves. She also told me this was the outcome she had hoped for and that the joint liability ruling was significant. I sat in the courtroom after it was over and waited until most people had left. A court officer I didn't know stopped near me and said, quietly, that she thought I had been very brave. I thanked her. I didn't feel particularly brave. I felt the way you feel after a very long drive on a road you've never been on before, tired, and relieved that you stayed in your lane, and not entirely sure where you are. My sister flew in from Tucson the week after the sentencing. She slept in the guest room for 10 days and we made soup and watched old movies and walked around the neighborhood in the mornings. On the 3rd day, she asked me if I was going to be okay, and I told her I thought so, eventually. She asked me if I regretted pressing forward. I thought about it for longer than she expected me to, and she waited. No, I said finally. I don't. Why not? She asked. I tried to find the right way to say it. What I told her was this. For a long time, I had believed that being a good mother meant protecting my son from consequences. Every time something went wrong in his life, I had appeared with money, with patience, with the benefit of the doubt. I had done it because I loved him, and I had done it because I had confused love with rescue. And somewhere in that long pattern of rescue, he had learned something I had not intended to teach him, that there would always be a net, that the bottom would never really fall out, that I would always be there, absorbing whatever he dropped. I don't know at exactly what point that lesson became something more dangerous. I don't know when it shifted from a son who leaned on his mother into a son who took from her. I'm not sure there was a single moment. I think it happened slowly. The way most things that go wrong happen slowly, incrementally, quietly, in small enough pieces that no single one of them looked like the whole picture. What I know is that the thing I did for my son that mattered most was not the $40,000 I gave him willingly, or the money I transferred in good faith when I believed in him. The thing I did for my son that mattered most was refusing to make myself invisible when he wronged me. I was 63 years old, and I had a red notebook and 38 years of proof that I knew how to build something and protect it. I was not willing to unlearn that at the end of my life to spare someone else from what they had earned. My daughter-in-law's mother sent me a letter 2 months after the sentencing. It was handwritten, 4 pages, and in it she said many things, some of which were kind and some of which were not. Near the end, she wrote that she hoped I understood her daughter had been under enormous pressure and had made decisions she never would have made otherwise. I read the letter twice. I wrote back one sentence, I hope she uses the time she has to think carefully about the decisions she makes from here. I mailed it the same afternoon. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and it is the thing I have thought about the most in the months since. On the last morning of the sentencing hearing, before anyone had come into the courtroom, I was sitting in the hallway outside with Patricia, going over a few final details. My son came down the hall with his attorney. He had to pass me to reach the courtroom door. He slowed as he got near me, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something. I looked at him. He looked at me. He had his father's eyes. Exactly. The same shade of dark brown that I had spent 40 years loving. He didn't say anything. He went into the courtroom. I sat with that for a moment. Then Patricia said my name, and I turned back to her, and we finished what we were going over, and I walked through that door, ready. I have started painting, finally. Watercolors, the way my mother always wanted me to. I am not good at it yet. My sister sends me pictures of her garden in Tucson, and I try to paint them, and they always look different from what I intended. The colors bleed into each other. The edges go soft where I wanted them sharp, but there is something about the way the paint moves on the paper that I find unexpectedly honest. You cannot fully control it. You set it in motion, and then you work with what it does. I think about that sometimes when I'm sitting at my table in the morning with my coffee, the window open, the light coming in. I think about what I set in motion, and what it did, and what I am working with now. It is not the quiet years I planned, but it is mine. All of it, still mine, and I am not finished with it yet.